Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 68 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Nashville Predators, in which the Sharks have lost 8-2, and it's been a while since the Sharks have had this much of a lopsided score put up against them. Perhaps it was to be somewhat expected. This was the equivalent of a small, tiny bird flying through the sky and then getting run over by a jumbo jet, but at least usually the bird can fly out of the way. The Sharks forced to go up here against a Nashville Predators squad that is on a 14-game point streak, including 12 wins during that time. Meanwhile, the Sharks, they just lost to the second worst team in the league and the fourth worst team in the league by pretty deciding fashions in regulation. And so they really didn't have a ton of a good chance heading into this one. I'm sure the betting odds, for instance, were quite in favor of the Nashville Predators. And yet in the first period, it actually didn't start all that terribly for San Jose. I'd say for the first 5 or 6 minutes, the Sharks were actually the better team, getting a few consistent shifts in the offensive zone, even a couple of chances as well onto UC Saros, with a couple of good chances to get a lead in this one. Perhaps that could have changed the tide of the game. Probably not still, but we will never know, as the Sharks could not capitalize on those opportunities. And then eventually it is Kostin who ends up taking a penalty, which ends up costing the San Jose Sharks their momentum and turns the game in favor of the Nashville Predators. They would end up scoring the first goal of this game from Yossi to make it 1-0. The Sharks would actually tie it up in the last couple of minutes with Mikael Granlund to make it a 1-1 game at the end of the first period. In the second period, the Sharks would do what not many teams have been able to do recently to Nashville, and that is to take a lead against this team. By making it 2-1, they become only the second team over this 14-game stretch that the Nashville Predators have played to actually hold a lead against them, along with the Minnesota Wild. In fact, the Predators have only trailed for a grand total of 12 minutes over their 14-game point streak, and this one, it only lasts about 4 minutes before the Sharks have the game tied up against them. And then the Nashville Predators do not look back from there. They take the lead, they add the insurance goal, and they make it 4-2 at the end of the second period. Now, at this point, it's not a disaster game for San Jose. It's the type of game where you go up against a really hot squad. You yourself are amongst the worst, if not the worst team in the entire league, but you played respectfully. You put up a couple of goals. You didn't look half bad. You had some moments. You could kind of leave that game with your head held high if it were to have ended at the end of the second period. But of course, in hockey, there are third periods. You do have to play an extra 20-minute time frame here if you are the San Jose Sharks, and yet for some reason it felt as though all the players on the team completely forgot that third periods even existed, as they came out here and just gave zero effort, as if they were doing a morning skate, if it was like a practice drill against this Nashville Predators squad who just completely ran them over. Players giving zero effort on the defensive side, puck watching, not covering their man, allowing players to just skate right around them. You take a look at like the 8th goal here scored by Novak Vlasic. They get around him quite easily. Addison's not able to win this battle here with Novak. That's an easy tap-in goal. Another one in the third period, Justin Bailey caught completely flat-footed, only puck watching in that situation when the guy who's 5 feet in front of him, who he should be tying up, is then able to just score a pretty easy goal. And that was just the general story of this third period. So many individual mistakes lead to these goals against. And so while after 40 minutes, David Quinn might be of the manner of, hey, you know what, we played pretty good against a really strong team who have been one of the best in the league currently, after that third period, that's just disastrous for sure. So even if you are of the mind that, well, you know, the Sharks, they still lost, isn't that a good thing? If it was a 4-2 loss, sure. As an 8-2 loss, though, this one definitely still stings. Definitely one of the worst games that the Sharks have played in recent times here this year. Moving on to the players to talk about, if there really is much to say. Honestly, many of these players were quite bad, but I do want to point out a couple of them. Starting off with the first line, Zetterlund was the best player, in my opinion, at least the best forward for the San Jose Sharks in the previous game against the Chicago Blackhawks. That did not carry into tonight's game. While his two line mates, I thought, did some okay things in the early parts, both Kostin and Granlund, Zetterlund was quite invisible even during the periods in which the Sharks weren't getting completely destroyed. And of course, once things fell off, Zetterlund did not really do any favors for his team either. When it comes to the second line of Eklund, Cunnin, and Zadina, I already mentioned at the end of last game that there should probably be a change to this second line just to try and spark something. And we can see once again here tonight, they're not doing much of anything. They're even in this game, may not have been the case in the last couple of games, but in this game, they were defensive liabilities as well. And it feels as though at this point, it's David Quinn sort of bashing his head into a wall, hoping that at some point, one of these three players is going to break through and have a good game on this second line and make the second line actually look somewhat respectable as a top six line in the National Hockey League. And that is technically a possibility. It is not impossible for any of these three players to suddenly have a good game at even strength, but it is quite unlikely from what we have seen over these last couple of weeks. And while, as I've mentioned in the past, there are not that many better options to play onto this second line, something does eventually have to change, because just bashing your head into the wall playing these three players together when it's absolutely not working very clearly at this point at even strength doesn't seem like the correct choice in my opinion. When it comes to the third line, this was really the only somewhat saving grace line, and in particular, as per usual, it seems as though I am once again going to point out Thomas Bordeleau's play, as in a sea of players who had pretty bad to really, really bad games, Bordeleau floated above the rest as a player who I thought actually looked kind of decent. Obviously, in the third period, he had his weak moments, as did literally everybody on this team. But in the second, and in particular the first period, I thought he had a couple of really nice moves in the offensive zone. In fact, just within the first few seconds of this game, he had a great pass to Nico Sturm in front, which was a fantastic chance for the Sharks to take the 1-0 lead had Nico Sturm not fanned on this shot. And this was a pretty meaningful game for Bordeleau, in fact, as he had his dad in attendance, not because he just made the trip to Nashville to watch his son play, but because he actually works with the Nashville Predators, and this is Bordeleau's first game against the Predators organization, so his dad gets a front row seat essentially to watching his son play, and I thought he definitely did a very good job, likely made his dad quite proud compared to the rest of the team, who was, as I've said multiple times already, quite awful here tonight. When it comes to the fourth line, the major thing that I want to talk about is the substitutions made. So I talked about in the previous review of the Chicago Blackhawks game that the Sharks went with a different type of fourth line. Most NHL coaches want their fourth line to be pretty low event. Obviously, if they manage to pot a goal, that is a bonus, but most of the time when they send over their fourth lines, they want them to be no goals for, no goals against, primarily the no goals against part. And so you usually go with a more defensive, physical type of fourth line. But the San Jose Sharks had departed from that last game by pairing Ryan Carpenter with LeBanc and Barabanov on the wing, and it paid off pretty well in the fact that they managed to score a goal, but at the same time it also burned them in the fact that they gave up a goal primarily due to some poor defensive play. And we see David Quinn try to play it safe and revert back to what he knows, what every NHL coach knows, and what every NHL coach does by going with the more defensively minded. So both LeBanc and Barabanov end up getting healthy scratch tonight in favor of Giovanni Smith and Jacob McDonald. Now, how does this work out for this line? Well, it does end up being quite low event as expected, and perhaps to the glee of David Quinn. I wouldn't say they were a very good line, definitely not the case, and they were probably worse than a fourth line should be in this game here tonight, and especially in the latter parts of the third period, they had a couple of really bad shifts, but so is the case for everybody. It's just definitely something noticeable to see that both LeBanc and Barabanov end up getting the healthy scratch. When it comes defensively, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Burrows. Now, both of these players were quite good in the previous game against the Chicago Blackhawks, and I thought they carried that rather well into tonight against Nashville. Obviously, you're definitely getting a much bigger challenge against such a stronger Nashville team compared to a significantly weaker Chicago team, and I thought Ferraro actually did a pretty good job in particular of living up to that. They were definitely the best pairing of the night, at least in comparison to the other two pairings, which were just completely disastrous for San Jose. Both Jan Ruda and Thrun probably had their worst games of the entire season for the San Jose Sharks, at least Thrun comparatively to like maybe his first game since getting called up this year. these two players just looked like passengers at least like 60 or 70% of the time that they were on the ice. There was not a good enough defensive effort from either of these two players on the vast majority of shifts that they had in this game. There was a shift where both of these players ended up caught on the ice for over 3 minutes, just unable to get off, primarily due to the fact that neither of them managed to win any sort of board battles whatsoever to force the Predators off the puck. They really were just completely abused here tonight. And the only reason why that we're in this situation here for this team, the only reason why they really got so crushed in this third period is primarily this second pairing, but also the third pairing as well. Calen Addison, really, really bad game. He had been somewhat better, I would say, over the last week or so, but this is a reversion to the mean for Calen Addison for sure. Just absolutely awful game, and Vlasic definitely not much better. He was having some strong games prior to the All-Star break. Since returning, it has slowed down quite significantly, but not quite to the level that what we were seeing earlier on this year. This is definitely more of an October or November Vlasic style of game. It was not good. It was not pretty at all. And then finally, we get to the goaltender, Magnus Krona. He lets in 8 goals. There is never a good thing when your goaltender lets in 8 goals, but a lot of these ones in the third period are just chances that should never really materialize if your players in front of him are actually have their eyes on the ball, actually are playing and participating in a real regular season game of NHL hockey. And clearly many of these players did not feel as though that was the case. They did not feel as though this was a real game that they had to actually participate in, at least when it came to the third period. So it's hard to put a ton of blame onto Krona in those situations, but at the end of the day, it is still 8 goals against, and it's not going to reflect particularly well on him. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they'll be taking on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Like the Predators, the Lightning are in a similar situation where they are fighting for a playoff spot. Unlike the Nashville Predators, who have been really on fire as of late, the Lightning have been a somewhat middling team, but this is also a team that is only a couple of years removed from winning back-to-back Stanley Cups, so the Sharks will still have their hands full. Class dismissed.